Welcome to the Legal Innovation Forum's podcast series, Leading at the Intersection of Business and Law. In this episode, we are delighted to welcome Virginia Neiswender, Associate General Counsel, Enterprise Privacy at Cox Enterprises. Virginia is going to talk about the vital role that she and her team play in supporting all Cox entities on matters related to privacy, cybersecurity, and data governance, including her approach to governance with regard to emerging AI technologies. Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for the next episode.
Welcome to the Legal Innovation Forum podcast. I'm Andrew Bowyer, the founder of the Legal Innovation Forum. Today, we are delighted to have Virginia Neiswender, who is the Associate General Counsel, Enterprise Privacy and Cybersecurity at Cox Enterprises, and based in Atlanta. Virginia leads a team of legal professionals advising on all Cox entities on matters related to privacy, cybersecurity, and data governance. Thanks for joining us today, Virginia.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, I want to say a big thank you to the legal team and Cox Enterprises as an organization as a whole for hosting our Legal Innovation Forum Atlanta a couple months back in September. It was fantastic to work with the team there and delighted to reconnect. So, Virginia, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your career path to date and how you've ended up in your current role.
Sure. So I didn't start as a privacy lawyer, no surprise, right? Very few people do. I actually started off as an employee benefits and bankruptcy lawyer. I've worked for the federal government, private practice, and at companies. And the employee benefits executive compensation route really got me into HIPAA originally. I had to become an expert because I was dealing with welfare plans. And when employers are sponsoring employee welfare plans, you have to understand protected health information and that entire framework and principles around not just privacy, but also security for that information. So as a result of that, I was recruited to a human capital management company, and I went in-house for the first time. And there, I was the only lawyer on the team who understood these concepts of privacy and security, including data breaches. And so as a consequence of that, I started heading in that direction, learning more about privacy, really getting involved with setting up compliance programs specifically for HIPAA, setting up compliance programs for the time GDPR and CCPA, but then also having to deal with cybersecurity incidents and really advising the business not just on how to investigate, but also if we had to notify our clients and talking through the liability related to that. So I had sort of a pivot in my career a couple of years ago, right before I joined Cox. And I was at the point where I was either going to go the more general counsel route and walk away from the technology, privacy, cybersecurity side, or really double down on privacy and cybersecurity. So the role at Cox came up and I decided to apply. And as they say, the rest is history. But at Cox, even that role has really evolved. When I was first hired, what they originally envisioned was someone coming in to define the privacy program for employee data at Cox Enterprises. So I was given a good bit of space to sort of figure out what did we need to do, how did we need to implement that, what were the gaps that existed within the infrastructure at the parent company, so at Cox Enterprises, because they are responsible for employee data for the entire organization in the US. And as I started looking at it, it became really clear that we were missing some of the backbone that was needed to build that program. So what that turned into was actually needing to stand up a data governance program to hang the privacy program on top of, and then partnering with cybersecurity to have sort of, so to speak, the third leg of the stool. So I spent my first year and a half building effectively 3 programs. I was building the data governance program, I was building the privacy program, and then I was improving on our existing records and information management program, all in partnership with the cybersecurity team. And I was just very, very lucky. Our chief information officer at the time believed enough in me, even though he didn't really know me, to say, Virginia, you go build these programs and we'll figure out where they sit after they're built and stood up. So then earlier this year, we consolidated all of the compliance and privacy teams along with the legal team into one large department. And as part of that consolidation, I was asked to lead the privacy team for the entire organization. So now I have a team of folks who we are responsible for Cox Enterprises, Cox Communications, Cox Automotive, and our growth operations as well as a privacy team. So we take care of privacy, data governance, and cybersecurity. So that's a lot. That's a lot.
Right. So it's interesting, and just as I want to learn a little bit more, especially for the audience's sake, about what Cox does, because it's an amazing company, very interesting. But in terms of that group that you're responsible for, what percentage are lawyers or compliance experts, or are they coming from different disciplines? I'm curious to hear about that.
Sure. So we're a team of four. Three of us are what I would call multi-discipline players, both privacy and cybersecurity. And then I've just onboarded one lawyer who is a straight up cybersecurity lawyer, but I'm starting to teach him the privacy side as well. And so we have to be multi-discipline in order to do this role particularly well.
Yeah.
And then we actually partner with privacy operational teams within the business to round out the privacy and data governance part of the program.
Right. Interesting. So to backtrack a little bit more on like what Cox Enterprises is as a business, it's a privately held company, amazing company. As I said, you hosted our event generously in the fall. And what my observation, Atlanta, there's lots of these fantastic companies that not everyone necessarily knows about. So tell us a little bit more about Cox and the business lines.
Sure, would love to. So Cox Enterprises owns, and a lot of people outside of the Atlanta area know Cox Communications as a cable company and an internet service provider, right? And so we're in 16 different states, and that's a large part of our business. It's about half of the revenue that Cox generates. It includes broadband, ISP, but it also includes wireless, which we stood up about a year and a half ago. And we do a lot of business with convention centers, but also residential individuals, right? So we really have this wide swath of folks we're dealing with. On the other side, we have Cox Automotive. And what most people would recognize Cox Automotive for is Kelley Blue Book and Auto Trader, right? So I mean, those companies have been around forever. And if you ever want to know the value of your company, most people just go to Kelley Blue Book and type in the information. So that's part of our business. But what we do more on the automotive side is actually supporting OEMs, so Toyota, Hyundai, those types of organizations, along with dealers who are selling online or selling in person to individuals, where their back end systems. At Cox Enterprises itself, we happen to own the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but we're also the majority owners of controlled agriculture businesses, so Bright Farms and Mucci Farms. We recently purchased it as our majority owner, OpenGov, which is a platform that really started as a communication tool for local governments to communicate with the community, but they do a lot more than that. And then we have Nexus Circular, which is a really fun, cool business where they recycle reusable single-use plastic bags into an oil that can be used to further produce other plastics. So it's a wide variety of different types of businesses with different needs and a combination of business to consumer and business to business.
Yeah, so highly complex company. How many employees are there?
So we're around, I think, 53,000 employees worldwide.
Wow. So in terms of like the strategic perspective, we can start there, and then maybe we can dive into a little bit more about specific areas around privacy, data governance, and security and cybersecurity. But responsible for all these different business lines, which are in and of themselves highly complex. So when you're coming up with that sort of governance structure and that strategy for the overall organization, what are your guiding principles there?
So I was thinking about it this morning and prep for our conversation, and I was thinking back to when GDPR was first adopted and everyone was trying to figure out how to adapt to it. And the conversation back then was, do you localize your privacy compliance or do you harmonize it? Meaning, do you make it the same across the world and worldwide? And that conversation persisted for a good while because companies were able to sort of move with the speed of the laws that were being adopted. Now, with the just increased number of not just the adoption of laws in the US and worldwide, but now enforcement actions by the different authorities, the question is no longer localization versus harmonization. It's about scalability. How
Mhm.
can you take a program and grow it to the size of your organization, accounting for the different risk appetites the different parts of the businesses are going to have? And so it's about creating a framework that to some degree hits the minimums, and then you can click up from there or stay at that minimum, but you have to be able to scale up because otherwise you'll just really break the back of the business as well as the team supporting the programs.
Right. And so if you think of, I mean, you mentioned GDPR, and it sounds like GDPR was a bit of a catalyst in your own career. So we're looking at, I think that was 2017, 18.
Mm-hmm.
That was coming into effect. I was based in London at the time, so I remember it well. Are you looking at that as the gold, as sort of the gold standard to base, even though, you know, you have all these different jurisdictions which may have different postures or different regimes, right? For example, California is a different regime than other states in the US. Would that be kind of the gold standard GDPR, and then to dial up and dial down after that, or has the world moved on?
I think the world's moved on. I think where organizations started with GDPR, they've stuck with it because their systems and their programs are built to flex to that model. But for an organization that didn't or doesn't have to flex to GDPR holistically, there's that opportunity to figure out what the right standard is. And what I mean by that is we still have to account for not just the state privacy laws that are being enacted,
Yeah.
but there's also a change in the enforcement environment. And that's really pushing us in a different direction. It's not just, you're looking at the state privacy law, what is it required? Now you have active enforcement on the consumer protection side, sort of disguised as a privacy related action. And it's considering privacy plus cybersecurity. And so it's a different bent to the way in which you look at implementing a privacy program. You have to account for the fact that, sure, the state privacy laws have a whole list of requirements that you have to meet. And then you're having to think about sort of the and piece of it. So as an example, a lot of the enforcement action we're seeing out of the FTC really focuses in on, are you transparent? Are you telling folks how you're using their data? And are you using that data only for those purposes? And the tools that they have in their toolbox to harm a company who's not doing any of those things are far worse than some of the enforcement actions that can happen at the state level. For example, there was a company, I want to say about 3 or 4 years ago, where they had collected data from online users. They didn't have consent to create an algorithm from that data. And the consequences was the FTC enforced against them by disgorging not just the algorithm that was created, but the underlying data. And that business had to totally go out of business because that algorithm was the basis of what they were doing.
Right.
And so whether or not GDPR is the gold standard is not necessarily the relevant question. It's what risk factors do you have to account for so that you're not stopping the business from being able to function should enforcement come your way?
Yeah, or innovate, right? Like
Correct.
if you've invested, so it's that sort of, I don't know if that's the same concept as privacy by design, which
It
is
is.
a hot concept. It's still I think applies for people in your realm. You don't want to go spend $100 million building a new business only to have that put you out of business.
That's
That
right.
would be
That's
a
right.
big error you don't want to make, right?
That's right. And to that point, right? Oftentimes what I talk about when I'm talking to my stakeholders is get us in the room from the moment you have an idea, right?
Yeah.
I think there is this perception that privacy is the no
Yeah.
for any question, right? If you don't want to do something, go ask the privacy team. And I think that, at least the team that I work with now, we were all brought up, so to speak, in a way where we were on the front edge of the innovation. We were in the room as things were being built. We all have some level of product experience, giving legal advice to products.
Yeah.
And understand give me all the possibilities, throw all the ideas with me. Let me cut your 100 ideas down to 50 and then move from there. And I'll give you some basic principles to abide by. So very much the privacy by design, give you a couple of principles to abide by, and then check in with me regularly so that I can catch ahead of time you going in a direction that's going to be harmful to the business, so that when you roll it out, you're in a good spot. And that there's a partnership that you have to have with just not just with the product folks, but the lawyers who are providing the product advice and counsel as well.
Right. Yeah. And how do you, like, I would imagine that's quite an interesting process as someone, if you're looking back at when you graduated law school, I'm sure some of the things you're ending up considering or talking about are things that you would never have imagined, right? On the cutting edge of innovative new opportunities and business lines within innovative business lines. How do you stay flexible and open to that, creative part and being a key player on that team, really?
You have to be curious and ask questions. I think what I've experienced and what I've learned is that the more questions I ask on the techie side, right, rather than the granular detail, the product teams or my technologists start getting excited because they're talking to somebody who they assume is just going to give a legal answer.
Yeah.
And if I'm asking them questions like, how does that work? How do those things connect? How does this other system that we talked about 2 months ago connect to what you're doing now? How does that process connect to it? Who's gonna do what? How does this function? What's the math or the science behind this? Is there magic? Asking questions and having them open up in a way that gives you enough information to provide them good, solid, grounded advice and just guidance becomes really important. Longer the days where as a lawyer, we get to just give legal advice.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be part counselor, part technologist, part help desk, part friend, right?
Yeah.
And just a good ear to listen. And I find that curiosity is what helps, at least me personally, stay in that creative space with the team to be able to just ask questions. And I'll be the first one to say, look, this may be a stupid question, but can you explain to me how that code works?
Yeah.
And the teams just get excited about that question because like, oh, that's not a stupid question, Virginia. And they'll just dive right in and explain it to me. And if I have to say, wait, hold on, I don't understand this word. Can you explain it to me a little more simplistically? And then they do that as well. And then if I still don't understand it, I'll ask again. And the funny thing about it is that I'll talk to other business folks who are on the call who I have close relationships with and say, gosh, I feel kind of silly asking all those questions. And it is not unusual for someone who is in the tech part of the world to say to me, I'm glad you asked because I had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's interesting too. I mean, one of it's just like a fundamental human thing that you're building rapport with people who you need to collaborate with to understand how your process. What I'm also interested in, like, I'm interested, when we're thinking about innovation in the legal ecosystem, which I am my firm belief is it plugs into all other the ecosystems, right? You work within businesses, you work cross-functionally. It doesn't live in itself. It lives alongside all the other departments. In fact, more so than any other department in an organization, I would argue. Do you see that way of thinking that you've been trained as a lawyer as additive or accretive to that business strategy or this creation of these new innovative business ideas, for lack of a better term? We're talking in general terms here, but what framework do you bring that you think as a lawyer, an attorney, adds incremental value to that creative process, which I'm an entrepreneur myself, is really important. When you're creating new things, you've got to be, there's all sorts of things that come into play. A lot of it's luck and hard work. But tell me a little bit more about what your take is on that.
Sure. So I absolutely view it as additive. And the framework is, as lawyers, we are taught to run down multiple paths at once, right? Yeah. There typically isn't one right answer. There may be a best answer, but there isn't always one right answer. So if you're, I almost think about it as like a decision tree, right? And you've got to go down a couple of paths and you've got to, hit some dead ends, right? And I literally almost see like the mental map in my behind my eyes around, okay, let me ask these questions. How far does that get me? Okay, wait, let me back up and start again, right? And just really, I think it by doing that, by asking those different questions and being repetitive to some degree, what you're doing with the business is having them rethink their assumptions, right? Because I have to question my assumptions. But by asking those questions, you're suggesting that they question their own assumptions about what they're doing, whether it's the right thing to do, the most efficient thing to do, the best thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that structured questioning becomes very helpful because the businesses see a path, they want to go straight forward. It's very linear in some instances to them, right? And by having that sort of multi-pronged approach, it gives them the space to think through what they want to do and maybe even find a nugget that they didn't think of before because you asked a question and they're like, oh, wait, can we go down this path? What do you think of this? What if we do these things? Is that okay? Does that meet the privacy requirements? Are we going to get in trouble? Can we go down this path? And oftentimes the answer is, yeah, you didn't think about it because you thought it was automatically going to be a no. So
Yeah.
go run with it, go figure it out, see what you can do.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I always think of legal departments and lawyers within them as quite omniscient in many ways, because you do get a real view of what's going on across the organization more than any other function, perhaps the CFO function, but it's slightly different. It's much more nuanced in many ways. And so therefore, that's a lot of value to bring to the table when, well, you're thinking of it in this linear way because you're a programmer, for example, or a product manager. And I understand that, but in the bigger picture, it needs to fit into the real world that I have to live in as an in-house lawyer, right?
That's right.
An in-house leader. I want to move on to, because I know we talked about privacy and all these things kind of merge together, right? Privacy, data governance, and cybersecurity, and data governance oversees it all, I would imagine. But we are in the AI era, without a doubt, right? And now we're entering year 3. So as a observer in the market, I'm fascinated to see how this is all going to be marketed and what this era means. 2023 was this overall excitement. This is a year of perhaps a reality check or realization, although the financial markets may think differently still, but that's a different story. So 2025, the first order of principle that you talk to anyone about AI is it's always been this principle with data is good data in equals good data out, and that's you're applying a new application to that, but that's rung true for many years. I mean, prior to the internet era, prior to any era, you need good data. So let's start at that. How do you think about data governance? And then just on top of that, in the last 5 years, I think the pandemic was a real turning point. This data trail that organizations create is so much larger than it was even 5 years ago. Where everyone's in the cloud, that's an assumption now. That was some sort of debate about that even 5 years ago. It seems strange. We all had to be in the cloud during the pandemic, and that just was a real catalyst. So that sort of data hygiene, that data structure, how you think of it, how do you approach that in terms of the broad terms and strategy? And then I want to talk about the context of AI with that in mind.
Sure. So data hygiene is a tough one because, to your point, right, it's been the last 5 years where all of a sudden organizations who had not previously focused in on how much data they collect and what they collect are realizing how much they have and that there's value in all of that information that they house. And so from a principled perspective, it is about, can you trace where that data came from and do we have the right to use it, right? Because if you don't have the right to use it, you got to figure out, okay, do we need to cordon it off or how do we need to treat this, right? Because until in the US, at least, until CCPA was adopted, there wasn't this particular mandate to always collect consent around the information or data that you might be using for something. It was almost a nice to have, and to some degree, right? And so now it's a question, the original question of, are you transparent about that you're collecting it and what you're going to use it for?
Yeah.
Have you collected consent if it's required? If you're dealing with a business to business sort of relationship, how much of the data is your data? Do you own it? You're able to do with it what you want because it's focused in on, for example, the way you built a product, the way you're servicing a product or a client, the way you're running your infrastructure versus data that your business client is sharing with you in order to provide services, right? So you have to sort of think about those different nuances to the data that we have, but then ultimately it comes down to what's your use case? How are you going to use it? What do you want to use it for? And are there ways to use the data that you do have to meet that use case without running afoul of any of those other either mandates, enforcements, or principles?
And so how do you how do you do that? It
How do
sounds like
you,
really complex.
yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? I mean, it's, as we started at the beginning, dealing with 3, 4, 5, 10 different businesses, right? And their different uses. And so it's really providing guidance to the business teams based on where they're at from a risk perspective
Yeah.
and the type of data they have, right? So we can say like, here's and I said this earlier, here's the baseline. And then anything beyond or different from that, you got to talk it through, and the businesses are accepting risk,
Yeah.
right? And they always have. I mean, that's nothing new, but it's, in my opinion, the more informed the acceptance of the risk is, the better off they are down the line.
Right. Okay. It's an interesting thing. I mean, when we talk about AI, obviously, like you're a publishing company and you have multiple publishers as well, right? And big trend, and I don't know if you're able to comment on it, but we've been noticing like OpenAI is being sued by the New York Times. I'm based in Toronto. There was a story last week that came out that a number of Canadian news publishers are suing OpenAI, and now we're in this sort of, I think AI, we could agree we're in a bit of a Wild West era about what fair use of data is. Even more so than the pre-AI era. So do you want to comment, or could you comment maybe how you think about it from a publisher as a content creation point of view? And then there's a content consumption point of view for other businesses, which is quite interesting about your role. You're kind of looking at all sorts of different things, right?
Yeah, so what I'll say is, so I happen to co-lead our generative AI legal working group. And so what that means is I, along with one of my peers, is responsible for gathering the right lawyers to have these conversations to provide guidelines and guidance to our business partners.
Yeah.
And in the context, sort of the publishing part of the world, and I'm not the deep expert on this one, what I'll say is that we have thought about and have talked about, how do you think about the value of the content that those news media outlets have created,
Yeah.
and maybe the subtractive nature that some of the AI that's scraping the web might have on that content, right? But also there's just the plagiarism part and the copyright part, right? There's all those different aspects to it.
Yeah.
So creating the right guidelines, but also setting up those businesses for success, because OpenAI has been having conversations with, and they're very public about this, open conversations with the different publishers to try and get licenses to that content. And in my personal opinion, I think that's probably going to be the way of the world, right? I mean, I think that the more we get to a state where we don't just view the companies that are developing AI as they can just go grab whatever they want, but you view them truly as a user of the data and content that's created, and talking through licensing, that will get to a place where it's just a better access, right? Rather than fighting and shutting down the different AI models based on the lawsuits, right? I think it's kind of one of those situations, at least, and again, my personal view, not Cox's view, right, is I think there's a way in which we can find that middle ground, and just having the right conversations about it. And it seems like, at least on the publishing side, that's the direction they're trying to go. We'll see how far that goes, though.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Personally, I started my career in the newspaper business with the Financial Times in London in 2005. So I was involved with that massive transformation. It's a great industry to cut your teeth in. And a lot of the work we do is actually based on my work then. But it's so interesting that these models of distribution, how they evolve, right? I mean, with the news distribution, it used to be you own the means of production and distribution of content through the printing press for newspapers, just to put an example. But television's the same, right? But we'll keep it as simple. And then the internet and search was just had a fundamental, and now we have AI. And I would argue probably the Canadian publishers are saying, well, if we band together and sue OpenAI, this gives us leverage to come up with a deal because we know it's not going anywhere. We just hosted a conference a couple of weeks back in Vancouver on the West Coast, and that was, AI is here to stay. And so it is a really interesting interplay. And ultimately, it's a good thing as long as they're following the fair use rules, because that gives a wider, broader distribution and impact of that content that all these journalists and hardworking producers have spent time creating, I would argue. But I can understand, it's an interesting time. If we look at AI and not just the fair use policy for content you're producing, which is again a part of your overall business landscape, like the organizational landscape. How about integrating AI into the business, the various business lines? And are there some examples? The business is keen to adopt AI because it's, it could be transformative. Your competitors could be doing it. There's all sorts of opportunities from it, and it needs to be used to be sort of figured out what it's valuable for. But from a legal perspective, it creates a lot of risk too. So how have you balanced that conversation, let's say 23 and 24, because we're almost at the end of 24. I'm sure you've been having a lot more of those conversations than say 21 or 22. And I mean 2021, 22.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. So it's been interesting. The organizations are still to a large degree in the we want to play around with it phase, right? I'm trying to think whether we have anything where we're using sort of the newest versions of AI in order to do something that's outward facing, that's public facing, right? A lot of the use cases that I'm hearing organizations are doing, including for us, are really internal use cases.
Yeah.
And so, for example, at the big telecoms conference that was hosted here in Atlanta a couple of months ago, I think it was at the end of September, one of the use cases that we shared publicly was we used artificial intelligence in order to assess the health of our network at Cox Communications, right? And see, sort of hopefully anticipating where there might be an outage or where there might be an issue. And so that's one of those use cases where it's wholly internal, but it has a very large impact to our client base, right? But that's also a more simplistic use of AI versus what, the big splash for generative AI was 2 years ago, right? And so, where I would anticipate us, not Cox generally, but sort of the industry's going, is really focusing in on how can we use that generative AI ability to interface with customers, to interface with other clients, to interface with other businesses, and do it in a way that is more meaningful than the rote, thank you for reaching to Max. How can I help you? Right.
Yeah, we all love those chatbots. Yeah.
Nope. Right. And I don't know that we're necessarily there yet, but I do know that, all organizations are trying to go in that direction, because the reality is that, call centers, not everybody wants to talk to a human being. A lot of people are actually okay with interacting with their phone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And knowing what their preference is. I put in just, can I talk to a person, please? That's usually my request. And then I get frustrated if they don't do that. The good companies do, but I'm sure people like to use the AI. Well, it's a really interesting dynamic at play. I know in the interest of time, I just want to wrap up the interview now, but this is a fascinating discussion. I'd love to chat more. I'd love to check in 2 years' time and say, okay, where do we stand now? But I have two final sort of questions to close things out. The first is, what do you think this landscape, in terms of what your role encompasses, looks like at 2029, if we're having this conversation 5 years from now? Do you think all these, which of these trends do you think will continue to be paramount or prominent? I know it's a long way in the future, and you don't have to answer it. You can take a pass. And then my second question would be, to lawyers starting out in their career, based on what has been a very interesting career for you, what principles would you invite them to apply in their own paths in terms of how to gain experience, to find out what your passion and where you can be most effective with your degree?
Yeah, so two great questions. So as to the first, so 5 years from now, if I look back on the last 5 years and the trajectory that we've taken, I would say the next 5 years, we'll see another bump and increase in state privacy laws and privacy-related laws, forcing us to rethink the way we advise the business around privacy, data governance, and cybersecurity to continue to make it scalable and risk-based rather than just sort of flat, here's the way to do it. I think by 2029, if I had to be a betting person, which I'm not, I would say the states that are going to adopt privacy laws will have adopted them by then, and that those states that have state privacy laws will be working together to do multi-state enforcement against all businesses, so that it's more painful if the businesses get it wrong. Like,
Right.
I think that's going to be that next major wave, because we're already seeing it with California.
Yeah.
In terms of what advice I would give to a lawyer starting out in their career, probably two things. Don't be afraid to fail and be curious. I think as lawyers, we're type A, we tend to be perfectionists. We tend to always get it right. And sometimes it's in that failure that you learn a lesson about what you didn't like to do, or what you enjoyed, or how to ask a better question.
Yeah.
And then in terms of curiosity, like I stated earlier, I mean, I will tell you, I view curiosity as my superpower. I'm willing to ask what others may view as a silly or stupid question, because I know that if I ask it, someone else is thinking it, and the answer I'm going to get is going to make me a better lawyer in the long run.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I love that superpower idea. I think I'm going to use that as my opening question on our next podcast. What's your superpower? Put people on the spot. But thank you very much, Virginia. I really enjoyed our conversation. Such an interesting space and area of focus for you. And as I said, I'm just so impressed with Cox as an organization. Such an interesting, dynamic business, and been delightful to work with the team at Cox and to interview you today. So thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for tuning in to the Legal Innovation Forum podcast. Stay tuned on our website for the next edition. You can listen to us on all your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in on liforum.co/podcasts.